Welcome to the Pianist TV channel. In this following masterclass, Graham Fitch discusses articulation and phrasing. The filming takes place at Steinway Hall, right in the heart of London. Before Graham begins his lesson, here's a quick glance around Steinway's impressive showroom and Hall of Fame. On this introduction, Graham plays Chopin's Polonaise in C-sharp minor on a Model D concert grand, the same instrument on which he gives his lesson.
Hello, I'm Graham Fitch and welcome to this demonstration coming to you today from Steinway Hall in London on slurs and articulation. Now this complements the article I've written in Pianist magazine issue 70. In the previous two demonstrations which you may have seen, I talked first of all about legato and staccato touches, and then I went into the variety of non-legato touches. What I'm going to aim to do today is to tie this all together and present a demonstration where I talk about articulation, principally in the music of Bach or in the Baroque period, but I'm also going to touch on Mozart and the Urtext edition in general. Now, by Urtext edition, what I mean is an edition of music where the composer's markings only appear, not anything by an editor. The problem with Bach's music is he didn't really write anything other than the notes. He just wrote the notes. He didn't tell us how loud we're supposed to play them. He didn't tell us whether they were supposed to be legato, staccato. And whenever anybody asks me, can I do legato and staccato and portato and everything in Bach, I say yes, absolutely. The absence of markings does not stop us using these touches. In fact, it gives us freedom to use anything we want to do. As long as it conforms really to good taste, we can do what we feel. Now, I'm going to start off by giving you an example from Bach's C minor fugue, Book 1, which is a very popular fugue. And let me first of all play it for you, and then I'm going to tell you what it is that I do. Now, what I've got there is a variety of different touches. I start off the first cell I play with a non-legato touch. It's not really staccato, it's not legato, non-legato. Then I follow that with a staccato note, and then a tenuto note. I lean on that a little longer. I do the same for the next cell. Then I have a legato end. Legato. So what I've got there is, how many is that? 3 or 4 different types of touch that I use in that subject. Now, you may decide to do it differently, and that's fine. Whatever you see, whatever you notice in the design of the subject is fine to show. Because if you would listen to 10 different recordings of that by famous pianists, you'd find, first of all, 10 different tempos probably. Maybe you wouldn't find quite 10 different ways of articulating it, but you could, depending on the fugue or the subject. Let me move on now to the C major invention, which was in issue 50 of the magazine way back. And I'm going to first of all play the subject to you. Now, I prefer to play the subject legato. But if you wanted, you could mix legato and staccato. You may decide to play the beginning part of the subject legato, and then get progressively less legato as you go up, until the final jump from the C to the G could be quite pronounced, quite separated, if you like. I think a general rule with legato and staccato in Bach is when the notes are next door to each other, we tend to play more legato. When the notes jump bigger intervals, we tend to separate them. Now I'm going to play the beginning section of the C major invention, and I'm going to play my subject legato, and I'm going to play next door quavers in the left hand, or in the bass voice I should say, legato. But I'm going to be making separations for phrases as I see the phrases. Let me demonstrate that to you. And it goes on. I also noticed there that the music moves into G major at the end on a rising sequence. And that for me indicates a crescendo. It's absolutely fine to make crescendos and diminuendos in the music of Bach. In fact, if we don't do it, it's extremely boring. You'd get bored very quickly. And if you listen to all the great pianists, they absolutely do use a full range of touch and more or less a full range of dynamics. Perhaps we don't want the extremes of dynamics. We don't really want a triple pianissimo and we don't want a triple fortissimo. But other than that, we need to use a range. Now if I move on to the E minor Prelude and Fugue from Book 1, which we have in the magazine, I notice in my left hand that each half bar, Bach writes a bass note. Then the other semiquavers are more like filling notes, in between notes. So what I need to do is to accent this. I'll show you first. What I did there in my left hand, or in the bass voice, I made a little tenuto on the first and the third beats. Let me show you that in slow motion. Do you hear how I'm lingering a little longer on that? Why? I do it not because I feel like it, because I see in the design this on each half bar. There's a chord in the alto part of the right hand, and this is like the spine or the structure of the music. And these notes are the padding, the filling in between those main events. And that's how I decide to make the tenuto and to make the other notes rather softer. If I go to my fugue subject, I decide on a brioso touch that I illustrated before, which is halfway between a staccato and a legato. And that to me is the most appropriate sound for that. Now let me move on to two-note slurs. Now when we begin having piano lessons, we're taught quite correctly that the first note of a slur is longer and stronger, and the second note of the slur is lighter and shorter. That's absolutely fine. What I'm doing there is I'm using down-up movements. Down, up. However, not all slurs are created equal. And in this extract from Mozart's rather wonderful A minor rondo, K511, which we have in the magazine, at the end of the first phrase, there are 3 slurred semiquavers, which we would not want to play with such exaggerated down-up movements. What I'm going to do, I'm going to use the same pair of fingers. Let me first of all demonstrate it for you so that you can hear and see. What I did there is I tried to play legato with the same pair of fingers. So there's an almost imperceptible gap between each pair of notes, which is what we want. You don't have to use the same pair of fingers. You could use a more conventional fingering and just phrase it in your wrist. You see what I'm doing? It's up to you how you do that. I'd like to talk about short phrases of the sort that we find in Mozart particularly, where he marks very few notes under a slur, perhaps 4, or it could even be 2. Now, if we did that down-up movement that I've illustrated just now with that Beethoven example, if I do that literally, we distort the phrase and it sounds completely wrong, and it would be completely wrong. I'm going to now take the beginning of the second movement of K545, the C major sonata, and I'm going to play it wrongly. I hate doing this, but just for the purposes of illustration, I will do it. I'm going to do it according to the phrasing that we would find in an urtext score, but having misunderstood what those short phrases mean. That sounds very hiccupy, and it's not what's intended. Now, when we're reading Mozart phrases, phrasings, we have to bear in mind that in that period of musical history, piano music followed from violin music bowings. So sometimes we see these phrases and they're not down-ups, they're simply bowings, where a string player would take a new bow, not necessarily making a gap at all. It also could be like a wind player putting a consonant. So in other words, at the end of that phrase, I don't make a gap. The next note, I put a t syllable. In other words, I make a tiny little accent. Let me show you that again now, done in 2 different ways, both of which would be correct. I'm going to make the tiniest articulation between the end of the phrase and the beginning of the next, or the next note. So you hear that's still a line. I still preserve the line. Now I'm going to play it completely legato, but I'm going to put a t consonant on the note after the phrase. As opposed to this, which is the long line, which is a very romantic way of playing Mozart. Not that there's anything necessarily wrong with a romantic way of playing the piano if we believe in that and if we can be convincing. But if we're reading the urtext score, we need to understand what these phrasings mean. Now let me go on to another example, which is the K333 Sonata, and I'd like to end with this example from Mozart, the first movement. I'm going to play it again with exaggerated phrasings, and then I'm going to play it correctly, which we hear quite a lot. Now let me do this correctly. What I'm doing there is tiny, almost imperceptible breathings, a little bit like consonants in speech. I hope from this demonstration that you'll feel empowered and feel free to use all of the touches that we've been looking at in these demonstrations in all of your playing, not just where they've been marked by the composer, but also where they've not been marked. And to play in a grey, flat way would be extremely boring and actually, to my mind, unmusical and therefore incorrect. I look forward to seeing you again soon.